Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Soudhamini is a filmmaker, Fulbright Nehru Research Fellow, and practice based scholar currently based in Bangalore. Following close to 3 decades of creative practice as an independent filmmaker, during which time she also taught film production and cinema studies in India, USA, and Australia, she now works in cinematic VR. She has a PhD in film and immersive media from Deakin University, Melbourne, an MA in English literature from Stella Maris College, Madras University, and a postgraduate diploma in screenwriting and direction from the Film and Television Institute of India, Pune. She has just completed her first CVR film, Ode to Users, this time Let's Get the Dawn Right, which was released in 2023. We're so glad to have Shodhamini with us today for this talk, and I will leave it over to Professor Chaudhary.
Uh, Hi, absolutely. It's wonderful that our initial conversations by email, Soudhamini, you getting in touch, and then things getting delayed time and again. Nobody knew about it except you and I, and a couple of other people, have finally resulted in this talk today. And I can say without being fake about it, that I am looking forward to it because I really find the abstract intriguing, and intriguing is not the right word, absorbing, interesting in the best possible way. And it speaks to my own interests as a you know as somebody who's interested in the arts and cinema and as a writer myself. Um, and I'm going to read out your abstract for the benefit of people who haven't, who are from outside of Ashoka, and who haven't read the abstract, and also for the benefit for those in Ashoka who have forgotten what it says, and for the pleasure of reading it out. The term Manodharma. So I'm starting to read the abstract, after which I'll hand it over to Soudhamini. The term Manodharma in classical Indian aesthetics can be understood as informed improvisation and refers to that delicate balance between knowing and discovery, or of being prepared enough to recognize. Even the most accomplished musician does riyaaz for many hours daily, we are told, in order to sing spontaneously in performance. In this paper, I will look at Manodharma, not I, but I'm speaking on behalf of Soudhamini here. I will look at Manodharma as a methodology for screenwriting. Informed on either side by the dictates of story and film grammar, but itself free, or freeing itself by engaging lightly with both as references only, for taking off on a series of riffs as idea and as writing. This, I'm suggesting, is the stance or geste a screenplay can assume. I was interrupted slightly, but I like this sentence. I think this is a key sentence. I'm going to read it out again. Informed on either side by the dictates of story and film grammar, but itself free, or freeing itself by engaging lightly with both as references only, for taking off on a series of riffs as idea and as writing. This, I'm suggesting, is the stance or geste a screenplay can assume. Excellent. The next sentence is also interesting. For it is pre-eminently a post-textual, pre-figural space premised on irresolution. If things were to be fully resolved at this level, there would be no need for the film. So this is an extremely interesting philosophical position, to do with how it seems like an anti-Platonic idea. That those universals don't really exist.
Yeah.
They have the idea that there are universals isn't borne out by practice. We cannot proceed with practice on the basis that there is something called a story, there is something called this or that. What the writer director does then is to notate an anticipation, allowing for all modes of sentience, human, material, nature, and grace, to come together in a collective improvisation that the filmmaker must be prepared enough to recognize. This, for me, is personal cinema that is true to the given moment and a particular set of conditions within and without. In this sense, Manodharma is equally a methodology for practice, practice-derived theory, and field-led pedagogy. That is the abstract, and it's in itself great. And when I said so to Soudhamini, she said, "Yeah, actually, I've written everything I wanted to in the abstract." So nevertheless, we will proceed on the basis that, there's always something to say which hasn't been resolved earlier. So over to you, Soudhamini.
Thanks a lot, Amit, for everything, for all the introductions on Facebook, and just now to sort of read it and recall it for all of us. And yes, also for all the arrangements. And it's true, actually, because even what I'm doing in the paper, though it's longer, I've tried to actually scrupulously stick to the abstract, because I think there's a certain argument and the sort of foundational space I want to set up. So I want to stick with just methodology and not go into methods, because then it gets very distracting and detailed and you lose the main thesis. And I feel like even I would want some kind of a feedback to say, are we on the same page? And also, like, am I thinking right? And so I actually see this paper more like a kind of provocation to initiate discussion and see where all it leads. And then over time to sort of develop all those roads, we don't have to privilege one way of moving forward. And just very quickly, because you mentioned Plato and ideas and stuff, it's also because this is very much from Deleuze that I was reading him a lot in terms of VR and the virtual. And he has this idea of the virtual as generative, that it exists only as potential. And that is the beginning of things. And that everything potential then gets actualized according to the conditions it finds itself in. And I think one of the things that happens when you have such a clear system of thought is that you then, so in a sense for me, it was not, that's how I argued, that was my thesis about VR as well. But it's sort of, when you think back on it, it's such a interesting logic that it's true as much for film. It's sort of like you can take it back into film, and it's just a way of seeing creativity, or how ideas get generated, how things come to be, sort of. So this, I think, comes very much from that kind of thinking, a sort of mapping backwards. That's how I think it started. So so as I said, I'm staying fairly close to the abstract. I'm just opening it out from within to let the ideas kind of breathe and for us to think between the lines. So just to sort of repeat in my own words, my own words now. So I'm basically trying to think here of how one brings together the idea of Manodharma from classical Indian aesthetics, conceptualized millennia before the invention of film, into contemporary film practice, and also why or what purpose it can serve. It's going to be possible to do this, that is, bring the two together. On the one hand, because the notion of Manodharma still has currency in other still practiced living forms, like I'm thinking specifically of South India, but not necessarily Tamil. It's also Kerala a lot. So it's music, dance, and dance theater, and all of which the term is very much in currency. It's a sort of acknowledged methodology of practice. So one could actually just study these forms, interpret them in the way you want, apply it to cinema, sort of extrapolate from it into cinema. But I'm also suggesting that it is in itself both a concept and a methodology. So, like for instance, when you say improvisation, it's both a noun and a verb. And so what I'm going to try to do is that because it sort of exists in this larger form, I'm going to suggest that the way it's being understood and deployed in these forms are not the only ways it can be used. Film doesn't fall into those practices. So instead of doing a sort of surface transfer between those, I want to go back to the original concept and say, how would I understand this in film? So I want to try and find a direct route from and the methodology as well, I think, is a larger idea than certain methods within a form, which are form specific and domain specific. So I want to try and say, how do we sort of, shouldn't I look straight within film to see how it applies? And then where necessary, one can compare methods or borrow methods or negotiate methods across, So again, just to put the film screenplay in context, I think everybody knows this, but it's worth repeating that film is one of the most process-driven forms there is. You script, then you go out and shoot. You bring back the material, often loads of it, to edit. Then, which means a lot of elimination and shaping and nuancing. And either alongside image work, you work with sound, or you do it separately, and that's multiple tracks of sound, words, effects, music as the basic, each of which are actually potentially complete on their own, but you're sort of bringing them together in conversation with the image and with you're working basically in a sort of a temporality which allows these coming together. Then there's subtitles, which involves a specific kind of translation act. And the thing is, film is changing at every point. Like when you've edited the film silent, when you've done the script, in a sense, you're supposed to know the whole film. Then you shoot and then you edit it. And just even silent film is, in a way, complete in itself. Sometimes you think sound spoils it. And then with sound, it changes. Like everything from the pacing onwards, everything changes. And with subtitles, then again, it changes because you're suddenly watching, like text has become image. And, and sound has become text. And there are all kinds of internal conversations happening. So it's as if cinema's default status is becoming and not being. And of course, it's not just these technical processes, because there are intelligences mediating and being mediated by the technology. The physical environment, like the locations you shoot in, there's a sense that certain things can happen only in certain places. And you sort of develop a relation to these places in the way you use them. So it's not just a figure ground relation. It's not just a background. And then you sort of learn to recognize that these places are also in process. So you shoot at particular times of the day, and then within a shot, the light can change. So there's a lot happening, in terms of, there are lots of processes involved in the physical environment. There's also always an element of the unforeseen in filmmaking. Like, however much you plan, there'll be something that there are just so many variables that there's always going to be an unforeseen element. But then as you learn to work with it, and this working with it always also includes eliminating or surviving certain, what seems like an accident. But it's also that the things that you include, you start to recognize, if you are prepared enough to recognize that the serendipitous, that which happens, seems to happen on its own around all your planning, and whatever happens, it somehow starts by the fact of you choosing to allow it to inflect what your plan. It starts to come together in a different way. It begins to cohere and also become coherent. It's like it starts to make its place within what you want. Changes the meaning somehow, and you've not even seen that earlier meaning in the same way till this random element wandered in, So, and the technology, of course, itself is not a given, because there are intelligences like hardware and software people who created it in the first place. I think before we go into AI and all that, people are forgetting there are intelligences that come before the technology. I mean, it's all been set up according to a whole lot of work that's already gone into it. And the way a lot of the softwares and films, since we went digital, the way they sort of customized is that they tried, it's like a whole research project in itself, because they try to anticipate all the uses possible with that particular software, and then configure them as affordances that you can use or not use. And in those choices that you make, again, now the technology becomes part of the film language. Of course, that's there even with the camera, everything that you choose with the camera. But it's so interesting because, for instance, when you were working with a Steenbeck or Moviola and all of that, the mechanical parts were fairly simple. Here, the range of options that are open, half the time you don't even know all that's possible. But the thing is, the difference is that technology is a service industry. It's about what they provide. But I don't think cinema is a service, and it doesn't have to be a service industry. So then, what are the rules you work with? So my primary thesis is therefore that if you want to be true to this process that's developing simultaneously across different axes, not simply to execute and transact it like an assembly line production, which is how some theorists, some critics feel that it was even invented, or the way it was used, at least in America, that it was the assembly line production where you bring in specific required skills at each stage and they contribute to that particular, so that it became the ultimate alienated labor. And yet it was supposed to be film. So if you're not wanting to work like that, and to also by the time you finish the film, to tick certain boxes and fit the film into certain categories, then it's actually simply not possible to anticipate the final film. And the whole thrill of working in this way is that sense of discovery. And the question is, what is the relation between conception and not execution, but discovery? What is the sort of equation you can have so it doesn't fall apart or completely get out of hand? So the reason, of course, that they want to do this thing called the bound script is it's a certain notion of efficiency. And that's why I'm saying that instead of a script that's fixed, we should set up a methodology that can handle this amount of variation. So what you have is a process plan, not a product plan. That's how I understand Manodharma. So there's also a third idea I want to flag already at the outset, which is probably the only thing I'm saying outside of the abstract. It's just that I think that I feel like there's a certain urgency just now for us to look afresh at what we call received knowledges, because like even a notion like Manodharma comes within a larger sort of framework which we have to look at critically today. And on the one hand, I think everybody who comes back from a stint abroad is somewhere in their mind, it's a bit of a salt satyagraha that you're doing. But it's also, I think, that it would be very naive to sort of engage uncritically with these ideas, because so I'm sort of also making something of a case for taking on board, in and through this investigation of art practice, the import of some of what some of these ideas have had on things beyond art practice, and I think through this we have to sort of somewhere question also those larger things. For instance, if we think of Manodharma as essentially an impulse and a practice of shifting out of fixity, that yes, there are reference points, but Manodharma is about mobility and the considered passage, if you will, in interstitial spaces, aligning oneself freely and fluidly in a given environment. So there are these references which are pegs, and it's up to the way you move, at what time you want to align with, and what time you want to free with, at what time you even want to completely coalesce with the fixed thing. So I think there's an element of mobility and of time, both of which are very similar to cinema, and therefore I think if this is the notion of Manodharma, I don't know whether we are even understanding the word dharma right. I don't know what the relation of all those rigid ideas associated with dharma is to do with Manodharma then, So that's the sort of overview or range of concerns I want to begin with. So if we could start to think of the screenplay alternatively to the bound script, if we start to think of the screenplay as suspended in a sort of dynamic equipoise with the generative potential to become, not become, mutate, adapt, transform, shed, reroute, digress, abort, and evolve, then writing in cinema or writing cinema really persists till the very end, literally in terms of the subtitles and figuratively in all the ways above mentioned and probably more. And basically the term camera stylo, or writing with a camera, which sort of came with the new wave, and it's the last time that they've sort of thought of a specific image by which to think of writing, of a practice as a sort of writing through the process of making. And but I feel it's not quite sufficient anymore once you understand it in this way. It doesn't quite cover the vitality and dynamism of this teeming, shape-shifting multiplicity that I'm sensing and I'm discovering when I work. So I'd rather think of it in this time of game engine aesthetics as a moving, undulating, algorithmic spine, proliferating a buzzing and flowering forest as it moves. And that's really how I want to propose that the screenplay is a sort of living consciousness that's sort of moving like an underlying spine through the whole film. That idea of thinking and making a narrative and, connecting bits is a process that's really continuing through the whole film. So now if we said, as I said in the abstract, if the screenplay is flanked on the one side by story and on the other by film grammar, then story is information, is it not? That's what is informing the screenplay. I know it's often used in contradistinction to information, but if the mise-en-scene is the cinema's expressive register, that means how it expresses itself in terms of image, sound, movement, space, time. If that's cinema's expressive register, then story is informational ground. And the problem with story is that it tends to settle. It is sedimentine, if there's such a word. It fixes ideas and people and places in the clutter of simulacra that passes for social reality. The more detailed, the more real. It used to be called art direction, now it's called production design. But the impulse is the same, that you just fill the space with things that are supposed to create this simulation of reality, when actual reality is just much more interesting. And to go with that, if that's the social real, then there's also a sort of false interiority of unprocessed memory as baggage, not a skill, that passes for the personal. Like everybody's story always has this backstory, and and then there's this villain. Everything follows from this unprocessed something that happens in the past. So in a way, even the quest to move forward is always about compensating or even discovering something that happened in the past. And so if this is ground reality, I'd rather levitate, just clear both flanks and take wing. So through a series of conceptual improvisations, I want to move from story as information to story as inspiration, as narrative context, as narrative essence, to arrive at experiential essence, and to then begin to build from there in the forest. Because the specificity of emotion is such that it is always experienced anew and afresh, with an intensity and a nuance never known before, that comes from rather than despite time's inflections on it. This for me is interiority, where story has curled beyond itself and come to rest in emotion. This is what Manodharma gives us language and measure for, to an astonishingly precise degree. And that's what's beautiful about it. But it's also the most sort of involved aspect of Manodharma, because, for instance, now I would have to go to the Natya Shastra and sort of talk of what is that original meaning, and then go to maybe those three or four forms which use it, and look at the ways they use it. And also, there's also a project I'm developing now, and this is sort of also trying to clarify in my own mind what is the context in which I'm working. So there's a long discussion there. I just want to flag it for the moment, and want to end with this idea. Thinking analog, but it is analog thinking to say that to make a 100-minute film, you have to write 100 pages of script. And that is the sort of industry requirement, that one page equals to 1 minute screen time. So it's a very analog way of thinking, But the digital signal, on the other hand, is generated by code, which means it works with minimal information, and then scope of expansion, which is like saying you work with a sense and elaboration. And if we take it to be that rasa, or what I call experiential essence, is, but it's a more versatile code than the binary code of the digital, because it has a minimum of 9. And if one takes that as the code, and the screenplay as the preliminary stance that the film takes, what in classical aesthetics would be called the sthai bhava, that you start in a particular position. It's an assumed position, to begin the elaboration. It could be as a character, it could be, and I'm saying the screenplay itself is the stance that the film takes in order to begin its performance. And that performance of the screenplay is the film. This is all I want to say, actually. I feel like if we sort of open it out now, I mean, Amit, what you would like to respond, and sort of open it out and get a sense of what are the things that have opened out from here? Because if we moved into the details, I think the clarity of this initial proposition would get.
Fantastic. That was very interesting. And again, it, for me, part of an ongoing discovery of convergences between your journey, your kind of thinking, and mine, as I had said to you the other day when I first read the abstract, I mean, I even had a symposium for which, there's a series of symposia that I organize and curate, etc., and put into motion in a series called Literary Activism, not activism in the way the word is used nowadays, but just to challenge the very, very narrow ways in which we narrowly celebratory ways in which we encounter literature these days, to challenge that. The symposia were created for that reason, and one of the discussions was about storytelling. It was called Against Storytelling. I told you about that, so you can see that, yeah, I mean, a novelist is supposed to be working primarily with narrative, and film is also predominantly a big courtesy. Popular cinema, mainstream cinema, Hollywood is predominantly seen to be a narrative medium, whether it's fiction or non-fiction. So I can come back to all of that later, but there are positions you're taking, critiques you're sort of making, which are of great interest to me. I'm making the same sort of critiques, but one wonders whether there is more of a lineage of such critique which survives to this day in filmmaking than it does in fiction writing. Now, to begin with some questions, well, I'm going to ask you 2 or 3 questions, and then going to open it out to the audience. The first is, where did you encounter the term Manodharma? And then the second thing, which I'm coupling with this question, so this counts as one question, I'm going to ask you a couple more after this, is that there's a whole bunch of people, if you look back at previous generations of avant-garde artists, visual artists, filmmakers, and poets like Tagore as well, who are tapping into these texts, the so-called Indian sort of texts of Indian antiquity, whether they are to do with aesthetics or philosophy, to further, certain agendas that critique either the Platonic or the Enlightenment sort of position on narrative, or the Renaissance on representation. That it must look real, to use your word. It must simulate reality, while reality itself is so much more interesting. This is something that I'd written down when I was 24 years old, when I was about to start my first novel, that whatever the imagination might come up with, it cannot compare to reality. It's unpredictability. So they were trying to find a way to sort of open up this space, and often looking at these texts, because they are also invested in many ways in the non-representational, not being tied down simply by the representational, these texts that we just mentioned, and not looking at them simply as our heritage, or ancient Indian wisdom or ideas. So the moment somebody hears the word Manodharma now, they will think this is not part of intellectual history. This is part of Indology.
Mm.
But it was very much, these words and these texts were very much a part of intellectual history
For
for
sure.
Indians and for and for Europeans and Americans. It's kind of very, very important to the formation of modernism, the circulation of these texts, among others. So I'm intrigued that you in a sense continue in this tradition, to open up really avant-garde ways of thinking, which still are worth sort of revisiting today, given the dominance that continues to pertain of Renaissance ways of looking at reality, the Enlightenment ways of looking at story and information. So Manodharma, and what kind of space do you think you occupy, in the sense that you tap into these terms and make them part of an intellectual and cultural history and argument? Who are your who's there behind you immediately in your formation, and who's there with you?
Okay, and they are kind of connected questions, so I'll try and answer. I thought I had written that, but maybe it was in a previous draft, that I think for me a lot of even the conceptual ideas come from the kind of practice I've done. I know it from, like, for instance, I trained in music, but I don't remember my teacher ever discussing Manodharma, And then there is, of course, the whole set of Professor Sambamurthy's texts on Carnatic music, and the 4th volume is titled Manodharma, for instance, because in Carnatic music, I think it's sort of split into 2 ideas. One is Kalpita Sangeetam, which is what is taught, and Kalpana, which is, I think, a common word, where it is to do with the imagination and that word and your own creativity, but of course, very much derived from or informed by the Kalpita, And so the Kalpana Sangeetam is often used synonymously with Manodharma. So it's sort of very much in practice. It's not an alien word at all.
I saw it recently on YouTube. There was a YouTube video of Bala Saraswati where in the information it did come up.
Yeah. So but for me, what's interesting is not so much the purely abstract, like the rag, it's not the ragam tanam where it's sort of pure elaboration. That's, in fact, for me, less interesting than how Manodharma occurs within the Kalpita, like within a kriti, what is the Manodharma that's happening? And again, it's fairly clearly categorized in the context of Carnatic music. But there's one, for instance, there's a thing called Neraval, which is like within the kriti, after you've done the first 2 sections, the Pallavi, the Anupallavi, and suddenly you pause at a particular line. Right in the middle of position, you pause at a particular line, and actually the word Neraval means like spread, So it's like the composition that's been moving is sort of opening out and filling up the sort of, and it's very interesting because there is percussion and it's a line, there's a line of text. So you can sort of, then there's a whole time of interpretation of the line, the talam, everything. You're working with everything, but just opening it out. And I like this idea of opening out within a text very much, And that's sort of the way, of course, Bala Saraswati was very well known because in dance, again, it's the same thing. The whole idea of Abhinaya was that just with the first line of text, she could interpret like for half an hour or something, where she's working at all levels. It's the rhythm, and then it's the meaning, and then it's the tone, and then it's the gesture. So there's just so many more. But for me, why I went to the Natya Shastra was because the third, which is Kudiyatam, which is a Sanskrit theatre tradition, in which actually the Manodharma is fabulous. And it's also very narrative based. So I feel like if I was talking about method, that's where I would have gone to sort of say, how do they open up? They do two things. One is they never do a whole play, or a whole play is always just one event from the Mahabharata. What they'll do, and that act can be stretched for like at the most like even 41 nights. Even now there are some places that do it like that. And then if you actually sort of enter, and the way I understood it in terms of the structure, because you can't make out when you watch, it's just so codified and so abstruse that as a lay viewer, you can't watch, you can't understand it, even more than Bharatanatyam. It's like, so actually I did one film in which I gave, this is Margi Madhu, I gave him a script or a storyline, and then he translated it into performance. I didn't interfere with that translation at all. I didn't try to tell him to do it this way or that way. But when I shot it myself, and when I shot it, the two things I picked up. One is, like, now I could understand the code. He didn't have to explain it to me because I knew what he was trying to say because I'd given him that. So the minute he translated it, and when you're shooting, you're watching very closely, and you can keep watching it afterwards. So I really began to understand how that language or how that code or those mudras, individual mudras, how do they become a language? So it was not anymore like a form to me, it was a language, And then I kept trying to do that with different people, that because I got that idea, then I'd work with somebody else and we would develop it together, and they would propose something and then I would modify. So I've been sort of working with this for a while now. And in some ways, that's how I understand the concept. Also at a very, very, and the Kudiyatam refers completely to the Natya Shastra to discuss Manodharma, because they talk of it in terms of how the actor takes on a certain, when, say if it's Bhima, then he begins from a certain position, and then because there are no props and.
That's a great comment. Alulika Datta has a question. Alulika, do you want to read out your question? You've put it in chat. Would you like to read it out?
Yeah, will you please read it out? Somebody has to unmute her, I think.
You're on mute. Or I can read it out if you have trouble sort of unmuting yourself. What might be the scope of the customized gaze that you mentioned earlier? I admire the idea as well as your conception of cinema as a discipline that is not a service industry. But I wonder if the gaze in cinema is necessarily customized to a certain degree in accordance with varied objectives. Or do you refer specifically to the technological aspect of such customization and its consequences on cinema?
I think I was talking about customization in terms of how the technology is proposed in the first place, that it's offering you lots of these options. But the problem is that the options are all proposed in a very open-ended way. And that's what I call as a service industry. It's like their selling point that you could use it in these multiple ways, not as multiple ways of working, of intervening either in the story or in the making or something. It's like and it's completely different from doing an open-ended narrative which says you can look at this in any way. This is about multiple use as a selling point, and therefore I'm saying that logic is the logic of a service industry. A lot of cinema also is, because it says when they say we want to appeal to the largest audience, it's the same logic for more tickets to be sold. And I'm saying it doesn't have to do that. Does that make sense? Hello,
it does make sense. I think I'm a little bit more preoccupied with the gaze that you speak about with respect to technology, right? The customized gaze, and I'm wondering what you. I'm still not quite sure I know what you mean by this customization. I mean, I understand what customization entails in technology, but I'm not sure about the cinematic repercussions of such a technological customization of the gaze, because we've always had some degree of technology, right?
I don't think I spoke of it. Did I? Was it in the abstract?
Yeah, you mentioned the customized gaze. I think that is a brilliant idea. I'm very curious.
I can't take attribution for it. I don't think I said that. I remember I only spoke about customization as part of the service they sort of offer you in terms of the technology, Yeah, I haven't really spoken about the gaze, but we should think about
it. Great. Any other questions? You should speak up, raise your hand, whatever. I mean, we have gone on for an hour, so we've made very good use of this episode. But we could talk about this for hours and hours, because this whole matter of no story leads us towards various kind of considerations which are very urgent for some people, not in the consciousness of others. But the
idea of story, it's not that I'm against storytelling, for instance. Yeah. Maybe I'm against storytelling, but not against story.
Yeah. But I just want to check whether people are just hesitant and shy, or really have.
Satya, do you want to say something? I don't know if he's there or.
Who? Satya.
Yeah.
There is a Satya I can see.
Okay, he's listening.
He's listening. Okay. So that nobody seems to have a question. We have had to. So to go back to.
Just like.
Can I just ask one question to set you off? Then you can sort of. Then we can end it. Just a practical question from somebody who, to whom some of these filmmaking sort of technicalities are words. I mean, don't really know them firsthand. But to me, this whole idea of editing, the fact that I mean, this was to me a very important idea when I was editing my first book. Because I had a kind of I had no story. I had a whole bunch of kind of stuff about a boy who was going to who was on holiday, had gone on holiday to his uncle's house. He goes there twice. The second time his uncle has a heart attack, then he gets better. And then when I began to put it together, it was a nightmare. And then as I began to take things out, it began to. I mean, there was a point at which I thought this. I have nothing left in this that I can use. And then I did salvage and rescue something from what I'd written, which became the final novel. And one of the things I discovered was that I could put two paragraphs together and even create an illusion of sequence when they had no connection to each other, actually. And then I thought, well, this is what film editors do, possibly. So the whole idea of this is going for sequence that a particular kind of filmmaking or storytelling opts for, and the kind of semblance of sequence where no sequence actually exists, which is the result of putting together certain moments, which is what I'm thinking of as a particular kind of technique, which has the technique is necessary because you have to jettison things which are dead or which are not working from all the stuff that you've got in front of you. So this leads me to think of film editing in a very sort of in very 20th century terms. But what is film editing like now in this age of digitization?
Yeah, that's a lovely question, because everything changed with what you call non-linear editing, because you can do it on your laptop, which means that the editing softwares, because for instance, first of all, when you were working with celluloid, not just video, it was physically you were cutting shots and joining them together. And in some ways that was non-linear, because you could remove the splice and take that shot and put it somewhere else and splice it. While in the first stages, like what you call linear editing, when it first got mechanized, as in like computer-based, then what would happen is, if you set up a certain structure, then if you had to change it, then you have to make a whole nother edit, a whole nother timeline, from which they move to what is non-linear, which is that you can just literally shift it, like you edit a page, Word document, right? And I have actually never, a lot of theorists, like from Eisenstein to Bresson, a lot of people talk of a shot not making sense on its own, and that if it makes sense on its own is a threat to cinema, because then it won't go with the another shot. But I've never worked on that logic. And I guess in a certain way that comes from the idea of a mise-en-scene, that you can do a sort of extended take, which naturally reaches, and that is itself an elaboration, of what you want to say. That it's not, that itself is not just information, that there is a certain unfolding that's happening, which is not just in terms of the duration of the shot, but how the shot is unfolding to the gaze, So that itself is an elaboration, and it is potentially complete in itself. And I've never seen that as a threat to the next shot. It is a certain stylistic you'll follow, that maybe you won't do too many small shots and then long, but you can also do that, because then you're working with rhythm. It's not metric rhythm. There's another rhythm that's set up between, and it's not an external. I mean, there are many temporalities happening there. One is the duration of the shot. One is the rhythm that's being set up by the movement. And then if the character is also moving, there's another rhythm. So then it's a different kind of coming together, I feel I've always worked like that.
Another question from Alolika is there in the chat box, and somebody called Shomarup has raised his hand. I'm going to sort of incorporate these questions and add thing that I wanted to respond with, because this came to my head, and then we'll close it after that. And what came to my head was, the use of near still or still cameras.
Yeah.
in a certain kind of cinema. I mean, so we are not there looking at montage at all. We're just looking at random stuff coming into the camera's vision. And there are filmmakers, Chinese filmmakers and filmmakers like Kiarostami, who seem to have worked with this idea that, if I just put, or Renoir actually said that, you follow somebody around in Calcutta with a camera all day, you will have a film. So this idea of this camera just doing nothing, and the narrative forming in itself or by itself is a practice that happens with say somebody like Kiarostami in some of the scenes that you seem to see something taking shape without too much interference in some of the scenes. I don't see it very much in India. I don't see the still camera just being there, recording a kind of reality which then begins to have an independent sort of reality of its own. It even happens on CCTV camera, I think, that something significant begins to emerge if you were actually to watch the footage. Now, that was one question that I just want to leave with you. And then Alolika, so I hope I'm not overburdening you.
No.
So Alolika's question is also with regard to fiction. I have a microscopic question. How did you find yourself navigating the transition between these seemingly distinct paragraphs? I wonder how spasmodic transitions may bear upon cinema. I like what was just said about Bresson and independent shots. Keep that in your mind if you can. And then the final question is from Shomadip, if he's still around, or I don't know if he's exited. No, there he is. Yeah, your question, and then just
Hi.
you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. Sorry, I've just had a nightmare internet situation, so I don't know how glitchy I am to you. I joined a little late. I missed a lot of the talk, sadly. But I was wondering, you said something about workshop, and I've been thinking about workshop a lot. And I'll just tie it back to what Mr. Chaudhary, Professor Chaudhary was saying right now. Funny, he's bringing up Kiarostami. I was just going to bring up Kiarostami, where that openness of cinema, when it's open to such that off-screen space is constructed through that stillness. I was watching 24 frames by him the other day, and there's just so much off-screen space, but that kind of openness, I mean, it can't be constructed. How much of it is constructed in screenplay? I'm wondering what your screenplay looks like primarily on the page, and especially also about workshopping. I mean, if you're really putting so much emphasis on workshopping, where your actors, their personalities are also shaping your script, what is the relationship between your screenplay and the workshop? And what does your screenplay look like on the page? I'm quite curious. I mean, how much detailing, etc., do you have? Thank you.
Okay, workshop, and then when you Alolika, when you say distinct paragraphs, you mean in the writing?
I would to what Amit said about him having put those distinct paragraphs one after the other into a scene. But I'm also how it on cinema, how does it we've been speaking about independent shots for so long. I would just
And Amit, your question was about stillness and thick story emerging, sort of, right?
Yeah, the still camera. I mean, I see, I may be wrong, I see a little less of that in India than one would have expected.
Yeah. I'll start with that. I mean, there's a very small snippet of Manipal on YouTube where he sort of laughing. He always had this sometimes had this very wry humor when he had to talk of something very abstract to someone in an interview situation where he doesn't know how it's, and he has to like snappily say something very complex, And I think they asked him about this thing about time, and he said it's like when nothing moves, time moves in cinema, So it's that sort of thing, I think. And I'm actually going to jump to the Kiarostami thing before talking of, and my own feeling, and this is sort of linked with the other half of the workshop question, as in everything that happens around how can it be scripted. That's of course how I started this whole topic, that you have to be prepared to recognize what wanders into frame. But my thesis is, it is not that it just happens in a certain way, and it's not that you just wait for it to happen. You set up things in a certain way. The only thing that you don't know is how exactly it will happen. Like but it's not, you cannot afford to wait forever, Again, to go back to Bresson, in fact, when I use that word grace, which is why I brought it into the unforeseen in the longer paper, because he worked with this notion of grace, and it's sort of the stuff of myths that he would take 54 takes and 55 takes with actors because he wanted that thing to happen. He doesn't know it. He cannot, what it would be. He cannot instruct them. But when it happens, he'll recognize it. But he did it in this very severe way. And I'm saying we have systems of working and we have methodologies by which we can. And then you can actually talk of the shot as a sort of laying a trap or a snare for that fortuitous accident, I don't like that way of working. I think we have methodologies by which there are certain things you put together in a way. So the only thing you're waiting for is the exact way that it happens, not when it will happen or will it happen at all or not. It's too much. You can't work like that. I mean, I would find it very frustrating to work. And my whole interest in Manodharma is specifically for that, because they have this way, they have these ways, and it's so precise because it's to do with measure. And that's the thing, because I was working with Maya, we're constantly told that it means illusion and stuff, but actually Maya comes from the root ma, to measure, So it's actually the formative principle. So we have ideas in this knowledge system which says, this is how you work for the unexpected to happen. Like even the impact, the rasa is the unexpected. The fact that at this moment, the audience will be moved. We've made such a mockery of that now, Even in music, they do it that, like you either sing very fast and then everybody claps. And, that's the mockery of it. But it's actually in its origins, the idea is that that it is cumulative, that experience is cumulative. So you build it in these sort of imperceptible measures until it happens, and I want to see if we can do that in film, that you sort of construct from the beginning in certain ways so it doesn't have to, that's the meaning of editing, It's not that you're putting random things together to make meaning, but that you're building it up so that the whole experience doesn't have to happen within that shot, but there's a whole sort of measuring process happening. The workshop says very simply that because I'm working with, I'm working with these two large epics, and there's this one point, the two epics this is Silappatikaram and Manimegalai, which are supposed to be the early Tamil epics. And I wouldn't even be able to do one, but I want to do two. And then there is just one passing reference to one, like the heroine from the second one goes to meet the heroine from the first. And they're like 2 centuries apart. And of course, they're not real. I mean, they're fictitious characters. But she just goes to meet this character. So I'm only working on that scene where the two meet, because then it's like the two epics have come together. So, but because I'm working with stylized action, I want to workshop with, and I workshop and then I write my screenplay. And those were the things I wanted to discuss when we discussed method, how much the start being able to work with your cast and crew can actually, it's not that the screenplay is not necessarily collaborative. You may still write it yourself, but it comes from within the process. And therefore this idea that the screenwriting never ends. It only ends when the film is over.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And well, I think we will end it for this evening.
Yes.
It would be great to have you back, maybe, as they say these days, in person. That would be really nice. And but thank you for adding to a conversation that we in this part of the universe have been having and are really interested in. So that was unforeseen. I got a sense of that from your abstract. What I first kind of heard from you. So this is great, and it's a kind of it's an example of how things can open out, and how the unforeseen can sort of animate and shape things. So great. Thank you all for being here, and for those who have been keeping late hours to be here as well.